Good evening, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here with everybody. And I'm really looking
Yeah,
forward to this conversation as we try to explore what Mshai Mwangola has had to share with us on orature and human rights.
okay. So now I can introduce you to our participants. I would like to welcome everyone to our last lecture of the Coloniality Now online lecture series on interdisciplinary perspectives on coloniality and decoloniality. So today we have Dr. Mshai Mwangola from the Orature Collective in Kenya. And she will deliver a lecture on African orature and the community as the custodian of human rights. So the title includes I am because you are. And it gives us a clue about the centrality of lived experiences of individuals and people's groups. Dr. Mwangola will introduce us Mshai Mwango's seminal essay titled African Orature and Human Rights. And then she will reflect on how orature can help actually catalyze communities of action around human and people's rights today. So Dr. Mwangola is an oratorist and performance scholar. She serves as the chair of the board of trustees of the Uriah Trust, and she is the vice president of the Transitional Council of the Society of International Development. She is also an executive board member of the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, which we know as Custodian, and she chairs its programs subcommittee. So she's a founding member of the Orature Collective, the Elephant.info, and the advisory board of Macondo Literary Festival. So she's also affiliated to the African Leadership Center in Nairobi. Now, I would like to invite Mshai to deliver her lecture. Please, so we see the presentation already on the screen. Mshai, the platform is yours.
Thank you very, very much. It really is a pleasure to be with you. It's a special pleasure to acknowledge the presence with us of so many of us across space and time. And most importantly, I want to start by acknowledging the work, the life, and I believe the presence of our Mwalimu Mshai Mwangola. In this liminal space between presence and absence, in a very interesting way, the fact that we are able to gather, despite being in different physical spaces, reminds me of something that another of our mwalimus, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, once asked, which was, what would African orature look like in the 21st century? And I believe that we are experiencing that. I would like to start, as any oratorist would, by greeting you, but also asking you to take a moment in whichever way you can to respond, in whichever way is practical and comfortable to you. I want to acknowledge in this space those who are present in the work that we will be talking about and express my gratitude to them. Normally, what I would be doing is I would be able to bring up faces and text citations in this, in the middle of this, but I tried doing that and it took up such a long time. So I'm going to cite some names and I just want to acknowledge and thank them even as I begin. I want to thank you for your presence. I do not take it for granted. We often think of a lecture as something that one person delivers and other people listen. But I want to acknowledge that it is your presence that makes this lecture possible. I am because you as a person are, and I am very grateful for that. We will be talking about orature, and orature recognizes that everything we do stands on the shoulders of those who have come before us. It is heritage that we receive. heritage that we experience in the present moment as diverse people. And it is heritage that will be passed on. So I invite you to be present. I invite you to please use the chat box. Normally, if I'm in a room, which is how I would normally work, I would be very happy to be reading your faces, your bodies, to hear you. And since I cannot do that, I invite you to make yourself present as we go along. I know you are muted, but in any other way that you can. So I will come back to several things. I will be touching on things. Usually, I just want to set this up as a way of warning. This is done as a 3-hour. Whenever I'm engaging this, it has been a 3-hour session that is very much interactive and a workshop. So there may be things that I will only be able to touch on, I will be able to suggest, and please forgive me for that, but I want to try and leave some time at the end for questions. And so what I'll do is gesture and say, hey, I hope if you have a question on this, please bring it up and we can discuss it. And as I have been talking, I hope for those of you, I got a couple of inquiries who said, could you just give us a little bit of a synopsis of the lecture? I hope you've been able to look at that. I will continue to be able to talk about what we are going to be doing. But let me start by just introducing myself very briefly. I am a performance scholar. And as a performance scholar, I'm very keen and interested in how people reflect on their current conditions and what happens as a result of that. I also like to define myself as an oraturist, and that is the definition that I use for orature, as an aesthetic intellectual tradition transcending boundaries in the making of meaning. This is not a definition that I will dwell upon for the purposes of this research, of this lecture, but I do want to acknowledge, because as a performance scholar and an oraturist, we always start by locating ourselves and also gesturing towards those who have provided the foundation on which our work stands. So I am an oraturist of a particular generation. I am Kenyan, and there are many identities that I will not go back to, but I'm going to own the identity of being a Kenyan of the Uhuru generation, because this is relevant to the work that we'll be doing. And I also want to pay tribute. I started by invoking the presence of Mwalimu Mshere Mugo. I call her my sister. I call her my teacher. I call her my comrade. I use the word Mwalimu, which means teacher in the deepest sense, because she is somebody who has informed, who has taught the work that I am doing, and who has provided the conceptual framework for the work that I do. When I speak of this as an aesthetic intellectual tradition, this has developed from the early work that you will see me talking about that was done in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, and that continues to develop amongst many others in the present moment. For the lecture, which I had put that up before, but some of the things we'll be looking at is this concept of African orature on one hand and human rights on the other, and also African human rights, and asking ourselves how this concept of human rights and this concept of orature come together, particularly drawing attention to the onion structure theory that Mwalimu developed, and how that engages with this principle that we call Utu Ubuntu, and leads us to the idea of human and people's rights. So what I will do is begin by providing a context to this essay. This will really be a reading of the essay. I won't have as much time as I normally have, which is where we take out and we begin to look at the essay in relation to who we are and where we are and what we are doing in a particular moment, where we look at the current context. We were just talking about this before we started, on how the current global, the current local, the current national contexts, that regional context that wherever you are, you may be aware of, is so current. When I was preparing for this lecture, I was so taken aback, and I was really torn between going into some of those contexts and evoking them and staying on the lecture. And I thought it would be very important for me to focus on the lecture. And if we have time, we can go back and look at some of those concepts. So at the end, we'll look at the context, then we'll go at the essay, what the essay says. And then at the end is an invitation, which will be your chance, hopefully, to speak up. So the context of this essay, this is an essay that has come out of a particular moment, out of a particular time. I would have loved to have been able to start by playing this video. For those of you who would like to go and listen to it, it's not a very long video. You can get it on YouTube. I hope you're taking the details, do a screenshot or something, because this is Mwalimu introducing herself. And I think it's a good place to start because she herself often spoke about the importance of self-naming and establishing not only her credentials, but making sure that as we come into a space, we are seeing each other as human beings. And she says that we have multiple selves and you cannot define yourself in one sitting. But I think this video gives you a really good snapshot of who she is, but also speaks to the issues that will be coming up. It's about 5 minutes, and so I ended up deciding not to do it. But she does say, if you watch the whole, Washanga Productions has a documentary on that, and you can look that up. But she does say that in the tradition of the African griot, which is the tradition we artists fall under, it is important to recognize that a griot comes to us with the idea of immediacy. And the question of immediacy is something that we will keep coming back to that. Immediacy means that you are always in your work connected to several things. You are connected to your material. You are connected in terms of your themes. And here she cites Pio Zirimu and Austin Bukenya, whose essay, Oracy as a Skill and a Tool for African Development, was very critical to the development of the question of orature. You are connected to the community and the people with whom you are creating this art. You are connected also to the vision that you are trying to create as a person. So Mwalimu was born in a particular moment in 1942. She was a child of relative privilege in that she was born to a family that could have been considered privileged. But at the same time, she was born in a colony and her family was among those who were colonized. So this whole question of intersectionality, this whole question of what it means to have privilege, that you have social, economic, and political privilege, but you are also at the same time disenfranchised, what it means to have been educated among the elite of her time, and what it also meant at the same time to be experiencing oppression as a racial minority in a country where you were a native and not a settler, to borrow from Mahmoud Mamdani, set her up to make certain choices that not everybody made, but she decided that she would embrace that privilege and use it to create liberated zones. And here I'm quoting from something that she often talked about. She went through life as a list of first. She was the first one to integrate high schools in Kenya in the colonial times by going to a white high school where she was the only African, and this was both high schools in general, boys and girls. She was the first to win as an African student to go win a scholarship to University of Oxford, which she then refused to take up and went to University of Makerere. She was the first Kenyan to get a PhD in literature. She was the first female dean of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Nairobi. There are many, many firsts. But what she chose to do with all of that was to spend her life, as her biographer has said, in the pursuit of Utu. What you will see, and this is why for her the question of human rights was so important, is that she understood the nature of struggle as costly and difficult. She understood her own life was one that, because she made the choice to be somebody who struggled to create liberated zones, she paid the price herself. And she herself was forced to leave Kenya in the early 80s and lived most of her life after that in exile in both the United States and in Zimbabwe. So this monograph appears at the end of a monumental era, a decade of her life, where she began as the first female dean of the Faculty of Arts at University of Nairobi, so a very privileged position. It was the decade when she was forced into exile with her children, where she went through a period of trauma in many different ways and chose to relocate back to Africa and ended up in Zimbabwe. And so all the things we're talking about immediacy are very much part of what she ends up developing. And in these three pictures, the one on the right, at the top right, is almost at the end of her life. She was awarded with a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Human Rights Defenders of Kenya. And this was, again, for them to say, here's somebody who was privileged, who didn't even live most of her life in the country, but chose in many ways to give sacrificially to the struggles in Kenya. On the left, you can see an essay that she gave towards the end of her life. But then she engaged this question of scholarship all through her life. And at the bottom, this is the poster of a celebration that happened when she completed her time with us here on Earth. And I like this particular picture because it is a stylized picture, and it was people celebrating the vision of what she represented for them. So, as I said, Mshai Mwangola was a child of multiple identities, a child of the colonial era, somebody who then went on, came of age during Africa's decade of euphoria, somebody who lived through the eras of disillusionment, who lived in multiple spaces. She famously identified as a Kenyan, a Zimbabwean, an African American, a Black American. She identified as a woman, many, many different identities, and chose to bring this all into the kind of work that she does. Why am I starting by giving this kind of a detailed introduction to her? Is because it brought her to a place where her work became a work where she lived with an ethos of responsibility. And she took her work into the space of the intellectual sphere. And when we go back to the question of immediacy, being always inspired by a vision, in fact, one of her most famous poems is called Taimagini. Can you imagine? Let's imagine together. Somebody who was engaged in the community that she did and who believed that her work had to make and have meaning in that community. So I'm going to just very quickly just put that up, but this described what she saw herself as: an intellectual who understood that she must demystify, first of all, what knowledge is, who understood that she was working in a realm that had often been, because she was an academic, the monopoly of the Western educated and Western concepts of what knowledge was. And she saw herself as an African having the task of having grown up with a diet, having earned the degrees, having become very successful in academia, to use that space to recover and to make the space, to liberate the space, and to go back to the foundation of the kind of knowledge that the majority of the people of the communities that she identified with were living in. And so when we come to the essay itself was published in 1991. And I'm not going to go into detail, but what I normally would have done at this place is to do a really detailed reading of what was happening in the country of Zimbabwe, where she was living at the time, in the region of Southern Africa. Remember 1991, you're in between Zimbabwe's independence, Namibia, but also South Africa is about to get majority rule. It is a time in the African continent where we are experiencing an oppressive structural adjustment era that structural adjustment has been imposed. It is a time in the world that is dealing, this is when Reagan is in America. We have HIV/AIDS. There are many, many things that are happening. And so if you bear in mind her vision and the questions that we were talking about, reminding ourselves that for her, this was a time to do battle. It was a time when all these questions had to be taken very, very seriously. And one of the questions that she chose to invest in was the whole question of human rights. She felt that in a crisis time like that, it was important to go back and ask, what are the rights that people, and as people, we're talking about collectives of people, but also human beings as individuals have. And she begins the monograph by starting by just laying out some of these questions. Invested in the fact that all societies have human rights, invested in the fact that the work she was doing as an oratorist. So Mshai initially came from a space where she was teaching literature and focusing very much on literature as written text. But at her time, when she was at the University of Nairobi after she graduated from Canada, so in that period in the 70s when she first went back, she became part of a movement that was happening across Africa, especially in newly independent countries, which was a movement to decolonize the academy. And many of you may be familiar with Ngugi wa Thiong'o's seminal text, Decolonizing the Mind. And she was right at the heart of it at the University of Nairobi. A lot has been written about the decolonizing of what was the Department of English and turning it into the literature department. But then beyond that, a pioneering group of people who are dealing with these questions on how to decolonize the academy in general. And one of the things that was coming up was this question of orature. Orature as the heritage through which Africans had conducted had done a lot of intellectual work. And her thesis was that orature would reveal how a society conceptualized human rights. Her argument being that all societies, even those that were considered to be second class in the world, marginal minority societies, all societies have human rights. And that if you wanted to know how a society conceptualized its human rights, you went to its orature. In its orature, you would find embedded what the sovereign, and the word sovereign, I'm using it to talk about the people, the people who decided what the norm was. Who was it in that society who had the power of determining what the human rights were? But even though you may have had a hegemonic power or a norm that was agreed on by everybody, there were always still a multiplicity of perspectives that were in conversation on what human rights were. She also then said, how are we going to find this out? How are we going to understand what the human rights of a society is? But how also would we understand and engage with the different perspectives that were and different situations in which these human rights were lived, how we moved from the theory to the practice of it? And she said, you go into the orature of that society. She defines it in two different ways in this monograph. First, as the verbal art, composition, heritage. And then this is also expanded, and this is taken from another monograph that she did called The Battle of Minds, where she said that this is the creative, imaginative art of composition that relies on verbal art for communication and that culminates in performance. And you may see how that's a bit different from what I had shared earlier. But these were some of the theoretical definitions that became very seminal to where we are today. She said orature is important because it is enjoyed, it is experienced, it is where the majority of African people, especially workers and peasants, are able to do intellectual work, to engage with intellectual products, to actually become part of the conversation, of the dialogical conversation that is happening on human rights. And she also says that orature, just like human rights, does not exist in a vacuum, but is culture and context specific. And so even the examples that she gives throughout the monograph, she keeps reminding us are drawn from a particular context. And orature in general, therefore, is an expression of the socio-economic and philosophical environments that inspire the composition, production, and the procreation of whatever is existing in that society. I am really sorry that I don't have time to really go into this, but the big break, the reason that this essay is considered so seminal, is that much of the work that had come before that on Orature had been basically trying to justify its existence, had been trying to justify its existence in the academy, and had been very much anchored in looking at the past. So people were going back and recovering and saying, this is the orature of particular people in the past. What she was doing with this essay was saying, yes, the orature of the past is important, but it is also important as orature in the present. And it's not just about this wonderful thing that people use when they want to entertain themselves. It is a vehicle that we can use to discuss the most important and pressing issues of our time. And therefore, for her, it was very important to locate this orature and to establish that you cannot go into this conversation. So she starts her essay by establishing the importance of thinking about a society in terms of its politics and its economics, in not delinking the question of orature, the stories, the songs that were often put in a place where people would say, this is what is not as important, right in the realm of what was most important. And so she does a reading of different kinds of society. Often we associate orature with the top left, the communal, but she would argue that orature exists in all kinds of society. And she also then has an argument on who is sovereign in each of these societies. So what is the economic structure? Who is benefiting? Who is oppressed? Who has power? Who does not have power? And she argues that all of these are going to become very critical in understanding who has rights and who does not have rights in a society, who determines them, and therefore what are the consequences of those rights. Again, this would be really wonderful to go into, but I'm going to restrict myself. So where does this then go into? In her essay, one of the things that she's really invested in doing is in making a distinction and explaining why the African Charter of People and Human Rights became so important and is, even though we already have a universal charter, the Declaration of Human Rights that was done in 1948. And so she does a reading of some of the reasons that it became necessary for the Organization of African Union, which is the predecessor of what we call the African Union today, why it became necessary for African people to come up with a charter of rights, and why this is not just a human rights charter, but it is a people and human rights. And so the first thing that you would probably notice is that the dates of the two are very significantly different. The date of the Human Rights Charter, of course, came into being in 1948. And she begins by agreeing with a lot. In fact, she agrees with what came in the Human Rights Charter, and the whole discussion around legal rights being the most important, or the most solid rather, because they can be achieved in a court of law, but that there are also moral rights which are coming out of these general principles of fairness and justice that apply to all people at all times, in all situations, and are possessed by everyone simply because you are human, you have these rights. But her argument was that Western-style democracies did not take economic and social rights as seriously in defining and in beginning to think through what it meant to have these basic rights as they did when they looked at the political and the liberties, the political and civil rights. And one of her big arguments was that if you look at the date when the UN Human Rights Charter was agreed on, there were no African countries in the room because I think apart from South Africa, apart from Ethiopia, all of them were under colonialism of one form or the other. And so it became necessary later on in 1981 for Africans to come together and say how universal was the United Nations Human Rights Charter. And so the African Charter, Union Charter of People and Human Rights, is not only looking at the norms that were defined as universal in 1948 by those who sat around that table, but it also looks at what was of interest and was centered by not just the African Union as the body, the continental body, but also looking at the movement of non-aligned countries that looked at, quote unquote, the global south, as well as what is contained in United Nations definition of universal rights. And therefore, the big thing that is emphasized is that economic rights are equally as important. And this is important because when you look at some of the abuses that continue to exist, so 1948, you continue to have colonialism, you continue to have apartheid, you continue to have a whole range of things that the United Nations seemed to think that were, this is fine. We look after individual rights, but we will not look at people's rights. This is something that she then goes into, and she then begins to say that the principle that we all know as Utu Ubuntu, I am because we are, is central in defining why for Africans you cannot talk about human, i.e. individual rights, without talking about people's rights. And therefore, in a discussion of human rights and people rights, within a decolonial context, if I may use that term, which derives from the way African people think of human rights, you must acknowledge Africa as center. So you displace the center that had been there. And we can go back and we can talk about this in terms of the implications for decoloniality. Let me just go back there for a second. Because you can then now begin to, this is called, to look at what that enables us to think about in terms of the Banjul Charter. And I think what it does is that it takes us beyond the way we think usually of, the pre-colonial, the colonial, and the post-colonial, quote unquote, periods. She's saying we can just think outside that box. And we can say that this box applies, the human rights apply without the context of the colonial in the middle of it. Now, I don't want to imply, and she does make the point of saying she's not negating the importance of all these rights that are in the Human Rights Charter, the UN Charter. She's just saying we need to go beyond that. And to explain why we need to go beyond that, she then takes us to the onion structure theory. This one does need a lot of time, but I'm not going to have the time to do that. So let me just explain it as much as I can. She argues that if we are to understand what African orature is and the philosophy that shapes it, and also therefore the contents of the African orature, we must place the orature of any people within the context of the specific mode of production and the specific society which generates it. Production, because this is part of the intellectual production of the society. And therefore, she argues that we need to look at the socio-economic and philosophical environments which inspire the composition, the production, and procreation of orature that puts forth intellectual and conceptual and epistemological cases for the existence of human rights in a particular way. And so her argument is that you must look, and I'm not going to go into each of these, I could spend time in each of these groupings, but she says that everything is interconnected. We could talk about the individual and the way your soul, your heart, your intellect, imagination, and then your physical being are all interconnected. You may only see the outer layer, which is the person. Like now you're seeing Mshai, you're seeing this face, you're seeing this body, but contained inside are all these different layers. You could think of an individual in relation to their community. You could think of an individual in relation to a family group that is part of the extended family, that is part of the clan, that is part of the community. You could think of it in terms of the world. You have a particular environment you're in that is also connected on the outward point to the celestial beings and the universe. You could think of it about the seasons of life and so on. But basically, you must always think of reality as constituting layers upon layers of interrelated, that are all different, that are all distinct, but a healthy entity, a healthy being must have health going through all of those different layers. Because when when all of the layers of the onion are not harmonized, when one layer is sick or is unhealthy or is rotting or is hurt, the whole onion suffers. So you could look at it on the outside, it could look very healthy. But if something inside it, and this is true of the world, if one part of the world is hurting, or one individual within a community is hurting, or one part of the society is hurting, then the whole of that onion, the whole of that world, the whole of that society, the whole of that country, the whole of whatever it is of that family has stepped out of measured rhythm. And what comes into that world instead is chaos. It reminds us of the line by Yeats that Achebe made famous, that says, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold." And so what Ms. Shere really was interested in doing was to ask herself, what is the role of the orator, artist, or the intellectual? And she saw the orator artist as an integral part of the community and somebody who, above all, responded to that community. They belonged to the people. The people had the right to criticize. The people had the right to be co-creators with them. And the job of the artist was not just to create out of their own imagination, but to draw from the inspiration, the themes, the concerns, the realities of the people. And what the artist then produced did not belong to them, but was part of this communion heritage that went out back into the community. So there was this very close relationship between the artist and the audience. They were co-creators together. That was the basic argument that she was giving. And what this then leads us is into a place where not only the artist or the intellectual has responsibilities towards the community, but the audience also has responsibilities to that artist. They share the ownership. And therefore, what that means is if that intellectual, as is happening in many parts of the world and in our country today, if that intellectual for any reason is under danger, the whole community comes out to protect them. The artist also recognizes that they are part of a tradition that has come from the past and that they will need to put something that will go out into the future. It also means that the audience must be part of not just the creation, but is part of all 5 parts: the producing, the communicating, the consumption, the reproducing, and the perpetuating that particular piece of art, piece of work, piece of intellectual, the ideas and the concepts. Because if the audience did not approve of it, they could refuse to pass it on into the society. So really what this comes into is an invitation to a conversation. And therefore, when the artist intellectual was creating, it was about taking all these elements, all this data from the society, the range of understandings, the range of perspectives, in engaging the community as a member of that community. So using their social capital and then crafting something that becomes a process through which the audience or the community could better engage the ideas, putting it in a vessel that enabled knowing as a product out of a process. Let me leave it at that, and we can come back to this if there are any questions. And therefore, what you then produce as a piece of art and the process of artists engaging in society was really that these artists were facilitators of a community conversation within the context in which these things mattered. Always bearing in mind that the audience had diverse people and had diverse perspectives, so that the artist, even though they may have been saying, this is what the norm is from the perspective of the sovereign, this is what your rights look like, was always expecting feedback from the audience that could then very much mean that you were shifting what was agreed as a norm, and therefore what human rights is, for example, would change in the process of this engagement. What she then does is she talks about different art forms, but she chooses to think about story, not just as a product, but as a process. The crafting as a shared process, the presenting as a shared process, and then the way people would then begin to talk about and would then begin to say, okay, this story is actually about our very real experiences. And therefore, we are being always invited to keep thinking about what this means for all of us. And she finishes the essay by doing a close reading of 3 stories. I've put that one is a fable, one is an ogre story, and one is a folk story, because one of the things that she tries to illustrate is how different forms of different genres of stories. So first of all, different forms of art, and then secondly, different genres of orature, of art in general, all come together to be able to enable different kinds of conversation. So one story is a fable which has an animal, and animals are always talk characters, and the protagonist is man, the human being. Another story is an ogre story, ogres being monsters, and therefore we are identifying with this little deer, this beautiful little weak, vulnerable deer. And then the third story is a folk story that pits a cruel man against the wife that he oppresses. And out of these stories, which she were collected from the community, you're able to do readings of different kinds. Normally, when I do a workshop, this is actually an entire hour. We read her stories, we look at them, and then we work in groups, and we do very close readings of the stories. We have a discussion on what people think the stories meant within the context that she was writing. But then we begin to think about, okay, these stories were true in a quote unquote, colonial context, which is where we assume they were taken from, but they were also true at the time of collection in the 90s, which is where this essay, in the 80s, which is when the story was coming. And then we begin to ask, are they true of today? And what I did, because we won't have time to do this, was the last time I did this, these were the stories that people came out, because people then go into groups and they look at one of the stories. So the story that had been the fable that had been the story of the elephant bullying the man. Most of you may know the story where the man and his family are in a house, it's raining. The elephant comes and says, can I put in my trunk? And the man says, first says, I want to come in. And then they say, oh, you won't fit. So then he says, can I put in my trunk? Because my trunk is very sensitive. And the minute he gets permission, he pushes himself in and pushes the man and his family out. And so it can be a story about settler colonialism. And settler colonialism, as we have been reminded in the last year, is alive and well in the world today. The second story, which was a story of the ogre story of this monster, this ogre that comes and eats the children of this delicate little deer. And that gives her the courage to organize all the other animals that have been oppressed by these ogres, becomes a story about the non-aligned movement. And one of the big questions we were then discussing is, does this even exist? It existed in the 90s. We all knew about Bandung and all of that. And in the 90s, we could talk about a non-aligned movement because we had the polarities of the Cold War. But then now going back and asking, what would it mean as smaller countries in a context of a superpower, or whatever you think of the world today, to look at? And then the third story, which was this story of the folk story, where you have a cruel man who goes to a family, negotiates with the father, and quote unquote buys a wife after this man has killed five previous wives, takes her away from her family, and then treats her like a slave, more or less. And at the point where he's really beating her, it's a story about really, really bad domestic violence. The woman finds the strength to call for help and is able to get a community of support around her, became a story on the diasporas of injustice. Whether you were thinking about the historical diasporas of enslavement, or you think about people who are going, in Kenya now, there's a whole debate about labor, people being taken to, especially the Middle East, as domestic workers and who are suffering terrible injustices. Or we can think about people going to Europe as medical workers and the kind of conditions that they endure to be able to provide for their families. So the point that Mshai is actually making is that we really must think about these stories. We must think about Orature, not just as something for the past, but really as something for the present that enables us to understand the conditions that we are in. And she does that by thinking through human rights. So I want to end. These are some of the conclusions that she came up with. Orature as a site to understand how societies conceptualize and engage, particularly with the question of human rights. We could talk about it with relation to coloniality, the way it affects the society it emerges from, and therefore it is not free from the society's prejudices. And you must always engage critically. And that Orature inherited from the past can have sophisticated insights for the present and can help us critique elements of the present. So it is important for us to continue to create this Orature in the present. What we call African Orature is not only Orature about us or Orature that only belongs to us, but it is an intellectual tradition that Africa offers the world as a necessary weapon against human rights abuses of all kinds. And I would like to add, when we think about decoloniality, it becomes a site through which we can think about. I want to end as I began. Many of you know that when we talk about Utu, Ubuntu, we often think about the phrase, I am because we are. I think one of the things that Mwalimu exemplified is that within the we is the you plural. That means that each person must take action because rights come with responsibilities. And therefore, the invitation as we go into the discussion or as you go into thinking through, I hope you will all get a chance to read this monograph, is not to just treat it as a document or a theory, but to ask how it can be deployed to make a difference in the world that you live in. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Mshai. Thank you very much for this fascinating, knowledge-rich, insightful, creative, refreshing lecture. I mean, I can continue just to add more. Thank you very much.